His voice was known to everyone, from generals to prisoners. He sang of pain, of love, of war, and millions believed he was one of them. But one day, that trust turned into a death sentence. He was Jewish, a people's idol, and seemingly untouchable, until a phrase was uttered in the criminal world. He's no longer one of us. Why did the idol of millions end up on a hit list? Who gambled his life away in a card game? And why did a single line from a film become a real code for murder? You'll find out why Bernes was considered a snitch, how his roles became mortally dangerous, and who was really meant to disappear. Him or another soldier. Watch until the end. Everything you thought you knew about Mark Bernes is just the cover. The real story begins behind the scenes. He was born in a town where the streets were paved with dust and tired eyes. Nizhyn was a quiet corner of the Chernihiv region where everyone knew their neighbor's business. The smell of old rags, broken kerosene stoves, and torn books was the smell of life. There, among the scraps of poverty and the creak of carts full of junk, a boy with the long-last name Naaman was born. In a home where a piece of bread was the main value, and his ragman father was the main teacher. Mark learned early on, if you want to get out, you have to go somewhere that doesn't smell of rot or poverty. He grew up among objects whose stories had long since ended. But this taught him to feel the drama of silent things. His father was often away from home. He wandered from yard to yard from morning till night, bartering cups for buttons and canes for felt boots. His mother was a grey shadow, worn out by chores. In such an environment, children grow up quickly, and Mark was no exception. At first, he studied at a trade and industrial college in Kharkiv, but notebooks and rulers couldn't quench what was building up inside him. He wasn't hungry for numbers, but for life, for the stage, for other worlds. He was a 17-year-old boy when he decided enough was enough. He didn't just run away, he left forever. Moscow became his new map. Here no one knew his father or his patchwork past. Here he could become what he dreamed of being. And the dream was a specific one. The stage. Not just any stage, even the most obscure. He went to theaters, offered himself as an extra, stood in crowds, silently, without words, just being present in the frame, in the sets, in other people's stories. He understood that to be heard, you first had to become invisible. He silently absorbed how others acted, how they worked with light, how the silence in the hall changed when a true artist appeared. It was then that he chose a new, short and sonorous name for himself. He had read a poem by Robert Burns somewhere, and something about the name stuck with him. Perhaps it was the rhythm or the pain. And so, Naaman became Bernes. No friends, no money, no connections, just an insatiable desire to be where the footlights go out. He dozed backstage, ate dry bread, and wore a shabby coat. But his eyes held a resolve that neither the Moscow winter nor the indifference of directors could extinguish. He didn't know how to retreat, and even when he was turned away, he would return quietly, like a shadow. Not because he didn't understand the rejection, but because he knew that one day they would say yes, and he would be ready. The chance in Bernes's life wasn't just a coincidence. It was the beginning of a turn he seemed to have been walking towards his whole life. He was noticed not in the audience or in the hallway, but where decisions are made in silence. On the film set. It was 1936. Mosfilm was looking for a face for a minor role in the film Prisoners. No one knew who this man in a worn-out jacket and with a troubled look would become. But he appeared in the frame as if he had always lived there. That's where Yutkevich, a young, ambitious director with nerve and intuition, saw him. He noticed not the technique. Mark didn't have it then, but something else. That same look, weary and penetrating, as if it had passed through 1,000 fates. Yutkevich didn't hesitate. He offered Bernes a role in Miners. It wasn't just a step up, it was a breakthrough. Suddenly, from a nameless extra, he became a carrier of real drama. The camera didn't scare him. On the contrary, it seemed to have been looking for him all this time. When Zhigulev from The Man with the Rifle first appeared on screen, the audience couldn't take their eyes off him. He had everything: restrained masculinity, a shadow of pain, anxiety for the future, and a certain touching humanity. He didn't act. He was. And the audience felt it. His characters didn't speak in loud phrases, break furniture, or tear their shirts. They just looked into the camera, and the audience understood everything without words. Filming became a new reality. He walked through the sets as if they were his home, knowing where the camera would be, where the light would fall, and how to turn his head so that the pain wouldn't seem contrived and the truth wouldn't look like a pose. He began to be recognized in the metro, on the streets, in bakeries. Some would say, "Isn't that the guy from Miners?" Others just nodded silently, as if they were meeting an old friend. But most importantly, he began to feel that cinema was letting him in not just as an actor, but as a carrier of an inner truth. He was a prisoner of the camera, not in a bad way. It held him because he knew how to speak without words. It was as if the stage and the lens were looking for someone who would show authenticity, not a performance. And Mark became that person. Everything changed when the film Two Soldiers was released. There, against the backdrop of burnt-out streets and the roar of war, Arkady Zhubin appeared. Not just a character, but an image in which millions recognized themselves. It wasn't a role. It was a destiny embedded in an intonation, a look, a pause. Zhubin didn't shout slogans. He just walked forward with restraint, as thousands did. He had what the audience couldn't find in newspapers and reports, a truth that didn't need to be explained. It was in this film that the unforgettable song was performed. Dark Night, Темная Ночь, was not just a musical interlude. It became the breath of an entire generation. At a time when there weren't enough cartridges at the front and not enough bread in the rear, this melody, with Bernes's husky voice, penetrated to the very heart. They listened to it in dugouts under blankets, in a whisper. Not because they couldn't be loud, but because it hurt. It had everything: anxiety for a loved one, unbearable waiting, the fear of losing, a tenderness they were ashamed to show in front of others, and a voice that was not a pop voice, not trained in a conservatory, but a human voice, faltering, and for that very reason, alive. After Two Soldiers, Bernes's name no longer needed an introduction. It didn't need to be signed in the credits. His voice was recognized from the first word. He became something more than an actor or a singer. He became the voice of a soldier who couldn't talk about feelings but sang them quietly to himself. He was invited to the front, asked to perform for the wounded, to record records. He didn't sing for fame. It was as if he was trying to hold on to those who had not yet returned and those who would never return. For this film, he received not only medals but something much greater: the trust of the country. Bernes was not discussed. He was accepted. He didn't pretend to suffer. He suffered. He didn't pretend to be kind. He was. And Dark Night became an integral part of the war, like letters from the front, like carefully kept photographs, like memories that make it hard to breathe. And from then on, Bernes became not just an actor. He became part of a memory that couldn't be erased by time or new names. After Two Soldiers, they no longer asked, "Aren't you that person?" He was instantly recognized at train stations, in shops, in hospitals. He was everywhere a voice could be heard that could cut through the silence. In a country exhausted and devastated, his songs became a kind of therapy, something that reminded people that they could still feel. He didn't just perform lyrics. He created a space where words came to life. "I love you" sounded not like a slogan, but like a confession from a man for whom life had slipped through his fingers. Seryozhka with Malaya Bronaya was not about a street kid at all, but about the bitterness that many hid behind memories. His voice seemed to know what loss meant and how painful it was to remember. He didn't shout into the microphone or wave his arms. He stood, his head slightly bowed, and just sang. But it seemed the walls were shaking. His voice had something that couldn't be deciphered. It wasn't loud, it was honest. And that was enough for people to turn off the lights in their homes, sit by their radios, and listen to Bernes whisper. It was as if he was speaking directly to you. As if he knew what you had been through, what you were afraid of, what you didn't have time to say. Do the Russians want war? Kotiat li Ruskiye Voyni? A song that had more diplomacy than any speech. They were afraid of it, but they played it. It was carried on records abroad, to exhibitions, to embassies. Because Bernes knew how to speak the language of the heart without unnecessary rhetoric, in a way that even those who didn't know Russian understood what it was about. This was the art of not persuading, but of feeling. In offices, officials racked their brains over the next cultural campaign, while Bernes sang, and he was listened to more than they were. He didn't have a party rank, but he became someone who was quoted, believed, and waited for. His path to the title of People's Artist of the RSFSR was not a rapid one. It was well-deserved. Every record, every stage, every breath before the microphone was a service. When he was given the title, he didn't change. He didn't become taller, louder, or more inaccessible. He remained the same man who once slept backstage, waited at the entrance, and begged for even a bit part. Only now, he had a country behind him. Not by order, but by love. And no directive could undo that. He was used to being in the public eye, but not like this. In the autumn of 1958, as his voice once again sounded on the radio, a name was being discussed in the corridors of the Ministry of Internal Affairs that should never have appeared in a criminal report. Mark Bernes, the country's favorite, a symbol of hope, suddenly found himself at the very center of an operational report on Khrushchev's desk. The document arrived unexpectedly. It spoke of a possible crime. Allegedly, a meeting of thieves-in-law took place in Kazan, where the fate of a famous actor was being decided. But there were no names or direct instructions, only hints, strange phrases, and a frightening line. He saw the film 2 Soldiers. In 3 months, 1 soldier must remain. Words that might have seemed like a joke or a quote in the context of a criminal correspondence looked ominous. Given that the main roles in 2 Soldiers were played by Boris Andreev and Mark Bernes, the officers began to wonder who was in danger. The report didn't name names, but threads were already being pulled to the past, to the shadows left behind in cells and camps. Where did this letter come from? Who wrote it? The answer came quickly. On the sheet, they found the fingerprints of none other than Lydia Ruslanova, a legendary singer, an honored artist with a difficult biography, prison experience, and a memory she couldn't get rid of. It turned out she was in Vladimir prison, and there, behind bars, she met a woman named Valentina Nazarova. The latter allegedly told her about her last lover, a thief who had lost a card game and had to pay with someone else's life. Bernes didn't even suspect how strangely his films were intertwined with real decisions in the criminal world. His image, created in a film, suddenly became the subject of a deadly game. The scene where Jubin and his comrade walk through the streets of a liberated city suddenly took on a new, alarming meaning. In 3 months, 1 soldier must remain. It wasn't a quote, it was a signal. And no one yet knew who it was meant for. Her name wasn't in newspapers, wasn't heard from the stage, didn't appear in the credits, but she became the invisible starting point for a story in which the past, revenge, and the strange logic of the criminal world converged. Valentina Nazarova, a woman whose fate had long been forgotten, suddenly resurfaced. And not just resurfaced, but brought with her a chain of events that threatened Bernes's life. Little was known about her. In the mid-1940s, Nazarova was serving a sentence in the Gulag. Among hundreds of others lost in the system, she didn't stand out until she ended up in the same cell as Lydia Ruslanova. The singer, who had survived hard labor, remembered her not for her conversations, but for her eyes. Tense, wary, with a kind of constant internal reckoning. Nazarova wasn't open, but one day she did speak. And this conversation, forgotten for years, one day returned to Ruslanova with new force. According to Nazarova, her last lover was one of those called smotriashchie, overseers, in the criminal world. A man with a name, a reputation, and connections. He played cards with a repeat offender who had just been released from a camp. The game wasn't for money. A task was at stake. The loser had to carry out an order, a murder. The target wasn't named aloud. Only a slip of paper was passed with a hint. He saw the film 2 Soldiers. In 3 months, 1 soldier must remain. The story seemed insane if not for the confirmation. Ruslanova remembered the details, told about the meeting in the cell, recalled Nazarova's words, compared them to what she had recently heard, and couldn't remain silent. She typed a letter, hid the names, but conveyed the essence. Her letter, strangely alarming, fell into the hands of the police and then went higher and higher. Now everything that had once been just a song, a stage, a film, took on a tinge of danger. In a peaceful Kazan, against the backdrop of the late Khrushchev thaw, a story from the prison rot surfaced, in which there were no fictional characters. There were real people, lives gambled away, and old grudges. And a man who didn't even know that someone had long ago put a card on him found himself in this web. When the contents of Ruslanova's letter landed on the investigators' desks, the first reaction was alarm, but not for Mark Bernes. The threads led to the other soldier from that same film, Boris Andreev, a powerful, charismatic man with a broad frame and a voice they believed. It was he, it seemed, who was the real target. Bernes was respected, even idolized, in criminal circles for prisoners, for 2 Soldiers, for the voice that played on records in prison clubs. He was one of us, although he was on the other side of the law. But Andreev's image was different. It was too direct, too ideological. And the police had something that could shed light on the motives. As early as 1940, Andreev had been detained. He was in a pre-trial detention center for several months, not for his actions, but for his words. At the time, while intoxicated, he had allowed himself to speak sharply against the party leadership. Someone reported him, a case was started, and he was isolated, but not for long. Stalin himself ordered his release. Why? It was never fully clarified. Perhaps it was patronage, or perhaps it was his reputation. But among prisoners, such stories are not forgotten. Criminals, especially the leaders of the criminal world, always distinguished their own from outsiders. Where someone was released by a special order, a shadow of suspicion arose. Who are you? An artist, an informer, a player? And now, imagine. The hero of a film in which 2 soldiers walk shoulder to shoulder could, in real life, be someone whom the thieves had blacklisted. The letter with the vague phrase about 1 soldier suddenly made sense if you removed Bernes from the equation. The operatives didn't make loud conclusions, but they collected everything: files, recollections, old protocols, and camp rumors. Everything pointed to Andreev being in disfavor. His past, his careless words, his instant release, his... All of this together created a picture of a personal vendetta. And although there was no direct evidence, the investigation was heading in this direction. Meanwhile, Mark Bernes, whose name was in danger of becoming an accidental victim of someone else's grudges, continued to sing, suspecting nothing. It would seem that if Bernes ever appeared in criminal reports, it would only be as a symbol. His voice was heard in cells, in transit prisons, and in camp clubs. He was not a stranger in this world. On the contrary, thieves-in-law respected him. But respect is a fragile thing, especially where everything is built on concepts. Up to a certain point, Mark Bernes was one of us. His roles as prisoners, soldiers, and ordinary people who had gone through pain spoke the same language as the audience on the other side of the bars. But everything changed when he became different, not in life, but on screen. In 1956, the film Case No. 306 was released. In it, Bernes played a police commissioner, a strong, principled man of the system. And a year later, Night Patrol was released. And that's where things got really interesting. His character was a thief nicknamed Ogonyok, who got tired, retired, and began helping the police. The criminal world saw this as a betrayal. It was just a movie, a role, an artist, but not for those who live by concepts. There, they don't make allowances for professions. They don't separate the actor and the character. And if you were once with them, and then you played a snitch, there's no turning back. Such an unofficial verdict could mean a lot. It wasn't even about a personal grudge. It was a symbolic gesture, but one condemned to reality. The man whose songs were heard in the camps now became the on-screen face of those who came to prisons not in a convoy, but with a search warrant. Bernes perhaps had no idea how deeply his new role was perceived. But in those circles where names are not forgotten, they began to write him off. Not openly, not loudly, but they noted that he had crossed an invisible line beyond which other rules began. And it was at this very moment, when it seemed that Andreev was in danger, that the real risk could also hang over the man who was once idolized. The films changed his status. He remained a hero to the people, but he became a stranger to those who once listened to Dark Night as their own prayer. And in this contrast lies the whole drama of the moment. The song that saved suddenly became a reason for revenge. The words, typed out and passed on to the criminal circle, were concise and terrifying. He saw the film Two Soldiers. In 3 months, 1 soldier must remain. To the uninitiated, it was a riddle. To those who knew, it was a verdict. A simple line from a film was turned into a cipher in which someone's life stood behind every word. They were both soldiers on screen, shoulder to shoulder, with a rifle and the truth of the front. In real life, they were 2 figures with different trajectories. Andreev, harsh, rough, with a past that could cause resentment among those who lived by different laws. Bernes, soft, lyrical, with a voice that was known even behind barbed wire. But that same voice, even though it was beloved, suddenly became too similar to a rejection of the old brotherhood, of the silent deal between the camp and the screen. Investigators couldn't understand for a long time which of them was the soldier who was supposed to remain alone. A shadow fell on both of them. Andreev had the episode with the pre-trial detention center, an unconfirmed conflict with the criminal world. Bernes had new roles that the thieves couldn't accept. One with a grievance in the past, the other with a grievance in the present. And both were in the crosshairs, albeit without a clear line of sight. Each of them could have become a victim. But at the same time, they were also bait. The phrase didn't name a name. It left the choice to those who considered themselves judges. Someone somewhere in a shadowy corner had already decided who shouldn't survive those 3 months. Someone had pulled that very card where the stake wasn't money, but a life. While the authorities were guessing, the criminal world was silent. No statements, no threats. Just one sheet of paper and someone else's memory, rendered in a typed line. The most terrifying thing was that it wasn't a joke. Not intimidation, but an order. Formulated as a riddle. To eliminate one of the two silently, so that only one voice, only one shadow, would remain. Everything depended on who was designated as the loser and who was the target. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and someone was waiting for the day when only one of the 2 soldiers would remain. For a long time, everything remained in the shadows. The operatives didn't know who to protect, who to put under surveillance, who to call for questioning. In the criminal world, silence was a sign that the matter was truly serious. No one was talking because the stakes were high. The threats were not repeated. The paper was not found, nor was the perpetrator. Until one day, everything changed in the most unexpected place. A regular church shop, an old building with icons and candlesticks in the center of Kazan. Father Artemia, an elderly priest, noticed a strange man at the counter. He wasn't looking at the icons or the candlesticks, but at the cash boxes and the money. His hands were twitching, his eyes darting toward the exit. A few minutes later, it all became clear. It was a robbery. Not of a bank or a jewelry store, but of a church. The robber acted quickly, but not professionally. When the attendants pressed the alarm button, the police reacted instantly. A chase began, frantic and sharp, through courtyards and up staircases. The criminal tried to break through an inner courtyard, but was intercepted. He tried to break through, pulled out a knife, and in response, a short shout, a shot, and it was over. Only later, when the body was taken to the morgue, when fingerprints were checked against the database, and a name surfaced in the system, did it become clear that this was not just a theft. It was the very man, nicknamed Berlak, real name Belyayev, the one who, according to Nazarova's story, was supposed to carry out the order. The loser of the card game, the potential perpetrator. The documents confirmed the connection. He was known in the criminal world. He had several previous prison sentences, participated in high-stakes card games, and had contacts with the people mentioned in Ruslanova's report. It all added up. It was he who was supposed to eliminate one of the two, the one he was pointed to. Now he was dead. And the case was closed because with his disappearance, the order itself also disappeared. No one else would pull a card from their sleeve. No one would continue the game where a life of one of the soldiers was the stake. Who exactly the target was remained a mystery. Perhaps even to Berlak himself. Perhaps he didn't know the name until the very end. Or maybe he knew, but didn't have time to see it through. Bernes never found out how close he was to the edge. He continued to live, sing, perform, receive letters from soldiers, and listen to applause. Everything turned out unnoticed. Without a point-blank shot, without chases in the streets. Only a short episode in a church shop became the finale of a dangerous chapter where art and the criminal world collided at a single point. He knew that the stage knew how to wait, that the audience was ready to forgive a pause if a voice would then be heard that they would come back for again and again. But time is not an audience. It doesn't give intermissions and doesn't tolerate postponed finales. The diagnosis was delivered quietly, almost routinely, in a room that smelled of alcohol and papers. Mark Bernes listened to the doctor as if he were talking about someone else. The conversation was not about a cold or overwork, but about something you couldn't outact. He continued to work, not because he didn't understand, but because he knew that to stop meant to give up. The last months were full of a strange energy. He sang as if he knew that the count was no longer in years, but in scenes, in lines, in breaths. His voice became a little deeper, his gaze more profound. He didn't complain. He wasn't used to it. The illness was insidious. It didn't scream or destroy everything at once. It was extinguishing from within what was his foundation, his breath. For a singer, this was a sentence without a trial. But he fought silently, without a scream, without cameras. Even his loved ones didn't always guess how serious everything was. Meanwhile, in high offices, they finally decided. His name was included on the list for the title of People's Artist of the USSR. It wasn't just an award. It was a recognition of a scale that had long outgrown the boundaries of genre, format, and system. He didn't ask, didn't remind them. He just lived as if there were no other options but to give himself to people through music and the screen. The documents were signed. Only the formal presentation remained, but time played its part earlier. The ceremony didn't take place. The law was strict. The title is not awarded posthumously. He passed away the day before he could have been named aloud. From a podium, with certificates, with flowers. He didn't know. Or maybe he did know in that very second when he realized that his song had been sung to the end, without repeats, without cuts. The final chord faded but did not dissolve. It remained in the voices of those who, years later, would hum his lines, not knowing they were performed on the edge of a breath. He lived a life that could not be measured by the framework of awards. His songs were heard where slogans didn't reach. His voice comforted in those moments when neither orders nor promises helped. But on the day the country was supposed to rightfully name him People's Artist of the USSR, a delay came that was impossible to fix. The law was cold and uncompromising. The title is not awarded posthumously. Everything that was supposed to happen was ready. Signatures, documents, solemn words. Only the ceremony remained, but he didn't live to see it. It was as if the final steps of official gratitude got stuck somewhere between departments and the calendar. And in this was a special irony, because no document, no paper with a seal, could express what he meant to people. He didn't need a certificate to be eternal. He was carried on the shoulders not of officials, but of those who survived to his voice, who loved to his songs, who remembered home listening to him from the front, from a hospital bed, from a distant station where the radio picked up Dark Night through static. He became more than an artist. He became part of the collective memory, part of the heart of time. And when he was not given what he deserved, it was not a deprivation, but a confirmation. There are titles that are not needed on paper, because they are given not by presidiums, but by the silence in the hall after the final note. Bernes remained forever in his songs, in his films, in the pauses between the lines where genuine pain and love live. And if the state did not have time to thank him formally, the people had already done so long ago, without ceremonies, without laws, simply by accepting his voice as their own.